Dina is the executive director of Nahalat Shalom in Albuquerque, New Mexico, which has kind of become my vacation congregation, I guess you would say, over the last 3 or 4 years. And every President's Day weekend, they put on klezmerkerkie, which is a 3-day blowout of folk music and folk dancing and folk art, as you will see. And this year, amazingly, they managed to deliver that online. And so I had a wonderful sort of 3-day virtual respite from Wisconsin. And one of the presentations that I saw was Dina's presentation on the art of paper cutting, which I thought was wonderful and delightful. And I had mentioned that paper cutting had sort of been on my mind because our PowerPoints are based on paper cuts from comic books. But I had always been kind of thinking, well, yeah, but those aren't really paper cuts, because paper cuts are, and when I saw her presentation, I realized that paper cuts have far more breadth and depth and scope than I was giving them credit for. So her talk is fascinating, and sadly for Nahalat Shalom, she's retiring in a couple of months, but happily that will give her more time for her art. And so we will look forward to seeing more of her production. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Dina.
Hi. Thank you. Thank you, Laura. Thank you for bringing me here. The picture that was sent out was a couple years ago. So the white hair is what you see from being executive director of the synagogue, including 1 year of COVID. So it's the same me, just white hair. So let me, I'm going to get started with my slideshow. If you have questions, we could ask them at the end. So let me just catch my slideshow. Also, I have an animated, the paper cut animation, which is 3 minutes long that we can end with. So let me just get started here. Give me 1 second so I can get my little pointer. Okay, so I hope that you can all see this. It says Diane Pally, Paper Cutting and Connections.
We can see it.
So a lot of what, and can you all hear me? Is this okay?
Yes.
Good. A lot of what you're going to see is about connections. For me, paper cutting is all about connections. If everything isn't connected, the paper cut sits on Was I muted?
Yes, that was my fault. I'm sorry. I was trying to mute other people.
That's okay. Am I?
So you're good. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just talking about connections. Paper cutting is all about connections. Everything is connected up. So the first slide is it's a huge paper cut. It's 6 feet by 4 feet. It was made for the Edenton Street Church in Raleigh, North Carolina. There was a pastor there who wanted to help his congregation confront racism and slavery. But being in the South, he couldn't talk directly about that. So he decided to bring the Holocaust commemoration into his church, and that way introduce the discussion of genocide. So he asked me to create, the church commissioned this piece. These are all original paper cuts. There are 10 separate paper cuts on the theme of, am I my brother's keeper? Am I my sister's keeper? We'll get back to this in the end. But talking about connections, he brought a Jewish artist in, and they put Jewish art in their church first. During the weekend of installation, synagogues brought their people to church services. First time these people had ever been in a Methodist church, these Jews. And we brought members of his church to synagogues, first time ever. And it was the beginning of a good collaboration of connections. So that's what I see art doing. Okay, let me see. Okay, before we get started, I just want to go through two terms very quickly. One is Hidor Mitzvah. You might be aware of this term. Wait, sorry, I wanted to do a midrash. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term midrash. We are not only allowed to interpret our text according to our times and trying to make it meaningful to us, we're encouraged to do so. So we don't have to accept it at face value. We can turn it and make it our own. What I do is visual midrash. I use paper cutting as a medium to make visual midrash. The other term is Hidor Mitzvah. Judaism has a huge and rich tradition of creation of beautiful objects and images. And this is the concept of Hidor Mitzvah is from a commentary on the verse, "This is my God and I will glorify God." But the rabbis, of course, didn't just leave it alone. They said, well, what does that mean? So what they decided was that the way we glorify God is to carry out every mitzvah, every action of our lives in beauty. So we can't just bless the candles. We have to have beautiful candlesticks. We can't just eat bread. We have to make a beautiful challah. And this has encouraged the development of our rich tradition of beautiful Jewish objects and symbols. So I wasn't always a paper cutter. I started out doing photography and architecture and quilt making. And then in the 70s and 80s in New Mexico, I joined the revolution and I became a political poster maker. And the way we made posters back then was silk screening, and it was old school silk screening, which Laura knows about. Laura knows all about silk screening. Back then, you would take a film and cut out the parts and cut out the sections you want to be inked, adhere it to a silk screen, and push the ink through. I learned how to cut all of the posters. I did dozens of posters, and I cut everyone with an X-Acto knife. And I liked the clarity, I liked the precision of silk screens. But then the revolution abated, even in New Mexico. Here's another one. I loved paper cut. I loved cutting. So I started stacking many colored pieces of paper together and cutting through each layer to create my own images of New Mexico. I just wanted to continue the effect of silk screening and paper cutting and cutting with an X-Acto knife. I'd never done Jewish art. I had done art for every community and congregation and struggle, but I'd never done any Jewish art until, I knew about other kinds of paper cutting. Some of you might have seen incredibly intricate Chinese paper cuts. These are very simple for Chinese paper cuts. I'm a paper cutter and I don't know how they do it. I live in New Mexico and we're surrounded by Mexican paper cuts. There are special kinds of paper cuts for Day of the Dead and for Christmas and Easter. And it's part of our daily life. People string them up. But I didn't know about Jewish paper cuts, and I'd never done Jewish art until a rabbi asked me to do a paper cut for the cover of his synagogue newsletter for Pesach. So I was also a printmaker. I did linoleum and wood cuts. I like, as I said, the precision of knives. I've never been a painter. I like cutting things away. So I created a linoleum block print of the traditional song Echad Miyodea, Chad Gadya. And you know, you can recognize the cow that drags the water, that put out the fire, that burned the stick, that beat the dog, that chased the cat. And there's Chad Gadya, there's one little goat, except I put my connection to New Mexico in there. I had these mesas, which are New Mexican, and I had a roadrunner, which was my way of making this piece of Jewish traditional art my own, in my own time and place. So I moved to Boston, deciding to give up art because I can't make a living, and I was going to go to graduate school. But I don't know if anybody's here has ever been to Boston, but there's a Jewish section called Brookline. And I walked into a Jewish book and art store called Colbo, and I saw this on the wall. And I thought, I'd never known that there were Jewish paper cuts. So I took a look at it and I said, gee, I can do that. And not only that, but I knew the language, I knew the symbols. It was my culture. And after having spent 10 years learning Native American culture and symbols and Hispanic and African American, for all these struggles I had illustrated, it was like coming home. I was very lucky to meet Joanna Martin Farron, who lived in Boston. They were, along with Cyril Waletsky, Martin and Joanne Farron were in that first wave of paper cutters. And they mentored me and helped me. And I also learned from Yehudi Chadur, a famous Israeli paper cutter. And as you see, some of them are white with different colored backgrounds. You can have different colored paper with different colored backgrounds. It's for being a very specific art form, it actually gives a lot of diversity. So I started learning about paper cutting. And one of the things I learned was that there are only about 150 paper cuts left in the entire world from before the Holocaust. Paper wasn't valuable. So the paper cuts were destroyed as opposed to some of the metal objects which were saved. In the early 1920s, Yivo went to Eastern Europe, collected folk songs and music and paper cuts and brought them to America. So most of the paper cuts that survived the Holocaust were brought to America before. So what I learned about traditional paper cutting, let me check my time, I think I have to start talking faster, is that before the Holocaust, in traditional Jewish communities, paper cuts, there was a paper cut for every holiday, for life cycles. It was totally integrated into the Jewish life. So this is a Mizrach. It's an east wall marker, and this is probably the most common use of a paper cut. In those old wooden synagogues in Eastern Europe, they would have this on the wall. And you'll see repeated imagery, which will be familiar to you, like the crown symbolizes God, and there's the 7-branch menorah. And then there's the classic Jewish elephant. Well, not really, but Jewish artists took great license, and they put in whatever they wanted. This was all cut out of one piece of paper and then painted over. And if you look at the top here, there's a double-headed eagle, which is the symbol of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So this artist placed himself, as you'll see, it was all men except for one kind of paper cut, in his time and place by putting that symbol in. Paper cuts were not only done in Eastern Europe, they were done all over the Middle East. So there's a Sephardic tradition, and the Sephardic tradition of paper cutting was more like the the Islamic world they lived in, where images of people and even animals were not allowed. So they developed this beautifully intricate geometric version. Um, let's see. This is a paper cut for Purim. When a dar comes, happiness increases. And when I talked about this interconnection, you'll see fish, because Purim usually happens during the astrological sign of Pisces. And in a lot of Jewish paper cuts, you also see reference to the astrology signs. So we weren't always separated out from the communities we lived in. We are rooted in our time and place. This is for a sukkah. It's to welcome the guests. And this is just incredibly intricate. So you remember the paper cut I just showed you from North Africa that didn't even have animals? Well, this is from Italy, about 250 years ago, and where figurative painting was a high art. So they put in a painting of Moses and a painting of Aaron. Again, our tradition has been reinterpreted in every time and place. This is a Yahrzeit plaque. If anybody can read Yiddish, this says Yahrzeit. The same way we have our big metal plaques with light bulbs in our modern synagogues, they would commission an artist to do a Yahrzeit plaque. And so these paper cuts were used the way so many things in our current world were made. One of the things that made paper cuts so popular is they're cheap to do. All you need is paper and a knife. Also, paper cuts were done it was started, kids learned how to do it, boys only, because they went to the yeshivas, they went to the schools, and they all had paper, and they had big wooden tables, and they had a pocket knife. So they would start doing these at about 12 years old, which is when I teach my kids. This is an amulet. And sometimes we think that Jews we don't have a tradition of superstition, but we do. So this was an amulet that was taken from house to house whenever there was a baby under 30 days old. And paper cutting was very communal. Everybody didn't have one of these, and everybody didn't have a mizrach. The community would have one. In this particular case, it would be taken from one house to another where there was another very young baby. So paper cutting's always been communal, again, connecting the entire community. This is an Omer counter. So it tells you each, they didn't have the internet, and you couldn't go to HebeCal to find out what day of the Omer it is. So this is actually a working calendar. This last paper cut is my favorite. This is a traditional Jewish paper cut. Why is it my favorite? Because girls didn't do paper cuts. They weren't expressly forbidden, but in the Jewish world, paper cutting became intertwined with text. And often girls didn't go to cheder, they didn't go to school, and they didn't know. So they didn't create paper cuts. It was lifted in the Jewish world from a folk art into something that required great learning as well. But on Shavuot, girls and women made these paper cuts. They were like our snowflakes, and they were hung in the windows to decorate for Shavuot, because it's a harvest festival of flowers. And there are stories of people coming into shtetls and at the beginning of Shavuot and seeing all the houses decorated with these paper cuts. So I was learning about traditional Jewish paper cutting, and I started doing paper cuts. And as I said, I moved to Boston to give up being an artist and go to graduate school and get a degree. But lo and behold, I did a paper cut and it sold to Cyril Waletsky's daughter, who was the first paper cut I ever saw. So I started learning and I started creating paper cuts. Um, this is an illustrated alphabet. Um, this is a silkscreen print of it. And if you can see, I try to put something that marks the place I'm in. So I'm from Philly. You might still hear a touch of it in my accent. So there's the Liberty Bell, illustrating the word drawer, which means liberty. Um, and I put in other symbols like a clock, because my grandfather was a clockmaker, was a watchmaker. When I first started doing paper cutting, I looked in my own memory for images. So we used to call this a pishka, a pushka. Is the Karanami box, those turquoise boxes, charity boxes for tzedakah. So I kept on doing paper cutting. This is an actual working calendar, which shows the our calendar is a lunar calendar, so that's the lunar month cycle, and each of the months has a holiday, and it's actually marked on the calendar, so you can tell when the holiday happens if you go outside and look at the moon. We have many cycles of time. We are now in the Omer, which is represented here by sheaves of wheat, and we're in the 5th week right here. There are also cycles when we pray for rain, and there's the cycle right before high holidays, and then the 7 days of creation, and the centerpiece of our Jewish time, which is Shabbat. This is what I call my social action paper cut. People often get it for people who do good work in the world. Whoever saves one life saves the whole world. So I was playing with the idea of the big Aleph, the Echad, one person. If you save one person, you save the world. And if you look closely, you'll see 4 animals: an eagle, a lion, a leopard, and a deer. And these are some of the Jewish animals, because in the Talmud it says in order that you should be swift as a deer, light as an eagle, brave as a lion, and strong as a leopard to carry out God's commandments. Sometimes that's all you see, and that's all that identifies a piece of art. There's the famous carved wooden synagogue doors that have these 4 animals. And if you see these 4 animals, you know that it's a Jewish piece of art in addition to Hebrew text. So I was commissioned to do a tree of life, and they said, put in as many animals as you can. So I think I managed to get 18. And in our tradition, Jews make connections. So animals stand for things. I often put in a rooster, because a rooster is honored in our tradition. It's the first animal to praise God in the morning. Here's the ram whose horn becomes the shofar. I wanted to do a parrot. They wanted a diversity, so I threw in a parrot. And you also will see the 4 animals that I just spoke about, along with the 7 species. In my artwork, I often put in the 7 species of ancient Israel: wheat and barley and grapes, and I think there's figs somewhere, and dates, and pomegranates. These 7 fruits, species of ancient Israel, are another marker of Jewish art. Also, crowns often appear, often 3 crowns, because in the Talmud it says there are 3 crowns. And the best is the crown of a good name. So I often put in 3 crowns. And in traditional Jewish art, you often see 3 crowns. I've illustrated a lot of books. This is from a master for a Reconstructionist congregation in Montreal, commissioned by Rabbi Ron Aiken, Oliver Shalom. So this was Avinu Malkeinu, show us righteousness and kindness. Well, how do you illustrate righteousness and kindness? So I chose to illustrate our asking God for this and God's ruling over us. That's in the master. Some paper cuts are more obvious. This was for the book of Jonah. The last line of the book of Jonah, where God is saying, "Don't you think I care about people who live in Nineveh and also much cattle?" So these are actually the kind of cattle that lived in Israel at the time of Jonah. The story talks about a gourd that grew and gave Jonah shelter. And I live in New Mexico, and we have a lot of gourds growing. And there was one growing outside my window when I was doing this paper cut. That's the gourd that was growing like 6 inches a day. I illustrated a book called Mystic Tales of the Zohar by Aryeh Weinman. So I did a whole series on the Sephirot, the mystical system of emanations that connect us, separate and connect us to God. So there's God up there, and then we're hanging out down here. And this is my teacher, Nehemiah Poland, used to call this the Tinker Toys or plumbing of the universe. This is one of those illustrations, and I chose this because we are in the fifth week of counting the Omer, and we are in the week of Hod, which is also splendor. And the mystical tradition makes amazing connections for each one of these emanations. There's a personality, that's Aaron. There's a day of the week of creation, that's your 5th day. The fish and birds were created on that day. There's a name of God, there's a part of the body, there's a time of the year, there's a time of the day. It's very holistic. It's like it's a hologram, the understanding of the universe, multi-dimensional interconnections. I did this for Jewish Women's Archives, which is a wonderful online archive. If you don't know about it, it's housed at MIT. And you might have seen some of their posters in your Hebrew schools honoring American Jewish women. And the quote is, "Women's wisdom has built this house." So I chose to do the moon cycle, which is tied to our women's cycles, and also a pomegranate going from seed to flower to fruit back to seed again. And here the same thing. And these are the 4 mothers. These are 4 intertwined pomegranates. When you look at these, everything again has symbolic meaning. By the way, that's a let me check time. Okay, that's wheat and a rose. And in many of my paper cuts, I put a sheaf of wheat and a rose. And I lived in New England for a long time, and there was a strike in the early part of the 20th century in Lawrence, Massachusetts, where the women in the factories, the textile factories, went out on strike. Their slogan was, "Give us bread, but give us roses too," saying that we need more in our lives than subsistence and surviving. We need to thrive with beauty. And that goes back to Hiddur Mitzvah. How do we live? We live in beauty. So often I put wheat and roses together so that when I give presentations, I can tell people about the bread and roses strike. I started doing paper cutting and translating it into different media. Part of it was I wanted to make it a bit more permanent. Paper is so fragile. So this is a tarot. I've done several tarot covers and parochet tarot curtains. So as if paper cutting isn't crazy enough, I do a paper cut, silk screen it on the fabric, and then quilt the fabric into a tarot cover. And this also speaks of my place, which is I love New Mexico. And these are the colors of New Mexico. It's the coral and the turquoise. And I learned from a Native American friend how to do beading. And this tarot cover was designed for some hot tarot because when you dance around with it, the beads jump up and down. This, by the way, was in the Spertus Museum, used to have these amazing contests for Jewish ritual objects. And they had a tarot cover as part 1 year, and this was in their traveling exhibit. I started silk screening on glass, sandblasting and silk screening on glass. This is this is a Mizrach. You can see those 4 animals. This is an east wall marker. This is 7 days of creation, silk screen, sandblasted in Concord, Mass. And this is a Newton. This was a banner and a tower doors. These are tower doors from Summit, New Jersey. These doors function as both a curtain and a door. This is another one. This is an arc. So I've worked with architects. I started sandblasting, paper cutting. So these are windows that are sandblasted in a synagogue in Summit, New Jersey. This is a Ner Tamid. It's in my own synagogue. And we have a strong Sephardic community, and we have a strong influence visually as well as otherwise in our synagogue. So this is that Sephardic motif, and the quotes are, "Let justice roll down like waters and righteousness like an everlasting stream." And talking about connections, this was commissioned by a woman, a lawyer, a member of our congregation whose father argued Brown versus the Board of Education in front of the Supreme Court. And she commissioned this in memory of her father, so that we now have that story to pass on. Okay, let's see. I think I'm doing okay. So a lot of my work in the last 20 years has been for a ketubah, because people need ketubahs. Your rabbi was telling me about her ketubah. A ketubah is a legal document. It's like a marriage contract, and people don't always need an east wall marker, but they need a ketubah. And traditionally, I meant to put in a traditional ketubah. There's a lot of those survived, and they're intricate and beautiful. So I started doing ketubahs. Now this is for a couple here in New Mexico, and I sit and talk with them about their lives and what they want their new life to be. So these notes are Willie and Waylon and the Boys, which is the groom's favorite song, Willie Nelson. The bride is the midwife, and the hands are catching, if you see up here, the hands are catching a crowning head. The groom lived in China for a long time. That's a Chinese kite, and he carved his initial. This means double happiness in Chinese, again, connections. There are the Sandias. Both of these people left New Mexico and came back. So we have 2 cranes flying back to the Sandias, to New Mexico. You also have things like windmills, because the bride, her favorite book is Don Quixote. And I've done an awful lot of bicycles. I think there's a bicycle in there somewhere. Yeah, there's a bicycle. A lot of bicycles. So this was made, most of my ketubahs have been made for interfaith couples. because they're the one, or same gender couples, um, because they wanted they wanted to formalize their connection. It wasn't as easy as others for them to do it. This was a rare Jewish couple, so I had their roots intertwined and then their lives going around each other. This paper cut was done for an interfaith. One of the brides was Jewish, the other one had Irish background. So there's a lot of Celtic imagery. So their roots are separate, but they come up to form a chuppah on top. People ask for all kinds of things. The bride and groom here went to University of Pennsylvania. These are the colors of University of Pennsylvania. They met at Philly Folk Festival. So there's the banjo with the face on it. And I did this. He proposed to her in Paris, and at the Eiffel Tower. And when I called up a ketubah maker friend of mine, I said, "You'll never know what somebody asked me to put in. They want the Eiffel Tower." He said he's done dozens of Eiffel Towers, so you'll see Eiffel Towers. People weave their lives together. This was again another interfaith couple. He went to Harvard. He wanted the shield of Harvard. Her mother grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania, so the bride wanted to honor her mother's Slavic roots. And there's a fluffy cat in there somewhere. Everybody wants their pets. And again, you see the rose with the wheat. This was for a Buju couple, Buddhist Jewish Taoist. So I don't do the calligraphy, but Jay Greenspan, Oliver Shalom, was the world's best calligrapher, and he agreed to do the text in the shape of a yin yang, which is another very specific, particular, amazing Jewish folk art called micrography. There's a tradition you use letters to draw a picture rather than pictures. You use actual words. So that's actually micrography. Here's the ketubah. Talk about connections. So it was a Catholic man, groom, and a Jewish bride. And the summer before the wedding, he walked. There's a famous walk in northern Spain where you go from church to church. I forget the name. So he walked it in her honor and wrote a poem every day for her. So that's why I have two churches in a ketubah. One is the church where they started, and one is the church where they ended. And they wanted the Hollywood sign, if you can see that there, because they lived in LA, but they were from San Francisco, so they wanted the Golden Gate Bridge, and they wanted, I don't think I can make it any bigger, but this is Kermit the Frog playing a banjo sitting on a park bench. So the challenge is to make it all connected, to have it a beautiful, connected, integral whole with all of these amazing, rich details. Okay, let's see, I have 20 minutes. So I also illustrated the book of Ruth. It's a wonderful collection of women's commentary on the book of Ruth. So I did the illustrations for this. This is how I got to North Carolina. And this is a woman's blessing. And these are the four mothers. I think the Hebrew, yes. Is it backwards? May you walk in the path of Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah. So I portrayed that with three roses. And I did this image of your people shall be my people. Where you go, I will go. And I chose the image of a deer seeking water to illustrate that because of the psalm, as a deer thirsts for water, so my soul thirsts for you. And I gave a lecture at Boston University when they were studying the Book of Ruth, and there was a woman there, the head of the Department of Religion for Duke University Divinity School, which is the biggest Methodist divinity school in the country. And they commissioned me to do these, and these are like 7 feet tall. They built a new chapel, and they wanted a Jewish artist because at the divinity school they made their students all learn Hebrew, so when they quoted the Bible they knew what they were quoting. And this was really radical for them to bring a Jewish artist and Hebrew into their space. So I illustrated, so this is so it's that same deer that Ellen Davis saw in that lecture at BU. And then this, so it's many layers of silkscreen and sandblasting. That's finally how I got to do this. I also, somebody else saw those panels in North Carolina, and then I was commissioned by a Methodist church in South Carolina to illustrate Psalm 150 for the entranceway to their music room. And the pastor of the largest Methodist church in Raleigh, in North Carolina, this is the paper cut they commissioned me to do, to allow them to bring genocide and slavery and the Holocaust into their congregations so that they could talk about it. So the way I illustrated it was in the middle with symbols of hope. And the burning bush is often used as a symbol of Holocaust survivors because they were burned, but they were not consumed. They're survivors. And so I put the boat, the actual slave boat here, and I put a broken feather talking about the genocide of indigenous peoples. I put burning books as stand-ins for the crematorium. I was hired to do this, and he said, make something so beautiful that people could bear to stand in front of it and learn about the horrors. So make it beautiful and give people hope. So this is the central image. Am I my brother's keeper? Am I my sister's keeper? Okay, great. We're going to be fine. So, as I said, we paper cutting almost died out. At the end of the Holocaust, maybe 12 paper cutters survived. Most of them went to Israel. A handful, 100 or so paper cuts. So these people taught another generation who taught a generation, and then I learned from that. So we took this art form, which was completely integrated and a vibrant part of our culture, which almost got destroyed, and it's been revived by paper cutters. So we decided in our synagogue to offer every B'nai Mitzvah student the opportunity to learn paper cutting. So as I said, I get a bunch of 12-year-olds and I give them X-Acto knives. And so I'm going to show you some of the artwork that they did. So they do a visual midrash. They give a talk about their Torah portion, like all kids do, and they also do a piece of art which they use on their invitations. They display it in the synagogue. They talk about it in their talk. So this girl wanted to talk about Havdalah and divisions, differentiations, separations. And so she created a Havdalah candle and Kiddush and the cup and the candle burning from it. And if you look closely, it's also two faces with the yarmulke on. The Kiddush cup turns into two faces. Again, interconnection, black and white. Everything forms the other. This kid really got paper cut. This kid was great. I showed him a book of calligraphy of all different alphabets, and he chose 12th century Sephardic version of Hebrew. And his talk was about Lech Lecha, and he had the road turning and a river turning into each other. And this is our Rio Grande, and that's our Mesa, which you saw in the first linoleum cut that I did. Very distinctive New Mexico landscape and the Zia. This kid's Torah portion was about the Mishkan, about the tabernacle in the desert. And she managed to put in the nighttime with the fire and the daytime with the cloud. And all the Jews camped around it. And she loves flowers, so she just had the whole thing blossoming. This girl, her Torah portion talked about going a road again. I think hers might have actually been Lech Lecha again. She was a violinist, and so it was very important to her to do violins. And then I think Laura might recognize this from, so this girl saw a paper cut I did and adapted it for her own, because folk art is free. You can't copyright it, you can't trademark it. It's free and open. And if anybody wants a collection of my black and white images, it's on my website. I'll tell you about that at the end. And you can download it, and you can print it, and you can copy it, and you can cut it up, and you can do whatever you want with it, because I inherited these images. They're free for all of us. This kid, now this was great. Her Torah portion was Acharei Mot, after the death of Aaron's sons. And she didn't like that story, and she didn't like her Torah portion, but she was a kid having an appropriately aged existential crisis. And she took just those two words, Jewish tradition, to just take the words and expand it. And it's after death. So she's talking about after death and the connection of life here and death here. And again, played with positive and negative images. Paper cutting teaches you to think about positive and negative, that the positive creates a negative. If you know Georgia O'Keeffe's artwork, this kid grew up in New Mexico and grew up with Georgia O'Keeffe. So there's one of Georgia O'Keeffe's, there's one of her skulls. This girl, her name is Anila, which in Sanskrit means boat. So another connection. So she did herself a boat and going into the future. This kid was the twin of the girl that did the first paper cut of the Havdalah. And in his Torah portion, it was all about what you can eat and what you can't eat. And he loved the fact that grasshoppers are kosher. So he did this great big grasshopper, and he had chocolate covered grasshoppers at his bar mitzvah kiddush, which we all ate. Okay. So if you ever want to do paper cutting, these are done by 12-year-olds. So I know it's easier for 12-year-olds to be creative than adults, but we can do it too. So I want to encourage everybody to experiment. So I wanted to show you probably know Isaac's work a lot better than these images I'm going to show you. But this is Isaac. I don't even know how to pronounce his name. Bryn Bialik, which is probably why he goes by nice Jewish artist. So as you see, it's an outline. It is a paper cut, and he uses collage technique. So I encourage young people to do that too. I'm also an art teacher at the Cheder, and we did graphic novel Haggadahs. The kids created their own graphic novel Haggadahs for their Seders this year. But this does both. It's comic books and paper cutting. It causes you, again, the same way the kids figured out the positive and negative, and it causes you to go background, foreground. You do this here. Background is busy and tremendous information and words and comic books, but it's still the Jewish lion. And he did this, again, it's his interpretation of struggle. So if you get intimidated by doing the more complicated ones, you could start with something simple and then you don't need paper, you don't have to do comic books, you can just get beautiful origami paper or rice paper. I started out using rice paper as my background. This is one of my favorites of his. It's Micha Mocha. So he actually put the text in the middle with the waves. So this is a very modern interpretation. And finally, oops, no, I didn't mean to have that. Okay, sorry, I meant to have my website up here, but it's just dianepally.com. And or if you need to get in touch with me, you can always reach me through Laura, because I'm sure to see her every year at Klezmer-Kirky. I invite you all to zoom into Klezmer-Kirky or come down to Albuquerque. We'd love to have you. Mikasa, Sukasa, as we say here. So we actually have 5 minutes for if anybody has any questions. So I think I'll stop sharing.
Okay, Dina,
I did that
to tell you,
5 minutes. Okay.
Dina, the two of the slides that you showed of Isaac are in our Siddur that we show on the slides every week. The priestly benediction one is the beginning and the end of every service, and the Micha Mocha.
Yeah, the Micha Mocha. Did you ask him permission to use them?
The CCAR commissioned him to, the Central Conference of American Rabbis. We bought it from the Central Conference of American Rabbis, but they did whatever it took to have his.
Oh, so they commissioned him, and then you buy it.
And we buy it from them, right?
Wow, he's not only a wonderful artist and creative and visionary, he's also has a good business plan.
Mm-hmm. Well, this was really interesting, and it's outstanding to see your work and what you've done with the B'nai Mitzvah kids. Who would like to open your mic if you'd like to ask a question?
Is there some place that we could see the process of doing this? What it takes to go in to do this kind of work? I mean, we see these beautiful, intricate things. How do you teach children to do this?
Wow, what a good question. Well, the harder part is to get them to think visually.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we talk about their Torah portion, and usually, they have to get their speech together. So I try to tease out of them some other aspect of it. Then when we do that, then it's how to get them to think about what kind of visual image would represent that. So we talk about symbols and imagery a lot. And I mean, you saw the work they do. They like one boy just came up with this great big grasshopper, or the after death paper cut, or the girl with Havdalah and the faces. And then we draw. And then we draw. And when we draw, we're also, I also have them do paper cutting exercises to learn how to use the pen, because the knife, because inevitably they draw things they can't cut. So it simplifies, simplifies, simplify. And what I started out talking about is connections. And you have to think about paper cuts as bridges. Everything has to be connected. So you can't really design this part without thinking about that part. So it's great because they learn to think about the whole. They learn to think about positive and negative space. You can't do paper cutting without positive and negative space. I do a whole class on, do you want it to be positive in the background, or the paper to be the image, or do you want the image to be cut out? And they get it. It's kind of intuitive. Paper cutting is done in China. It's done in Eastern Europe. There's a very, very rich tradition of paper cutting. You might have seen Polish or Czechoslovakian paper cuts. The difference between Jewish paper cuts and those in Eastern Europe is they became part of folk art and decorative. And Jewish paper cuts always retain something of the tradition, the text, the ritual, the history. But if you give kids a chance to think symbolically, they come up with it. And sometimes they start out with an image I have, but I tell them that's fine, because when I first started doing paper cutting, I wanted to do the 12 tribes of Israel. And it was around Hanukkah, and I had, you know, those Hanukkah candle boxes that have the 12 tribes? That's what I did. And you encourage them to think about what kind of animal they relate to. The girl that did the boat also had herself as not only the boat, but also a turtle, because they have totemic animals. So we talk about that. We talk about what animals stand for. So it's all about having them connect themselves to the world through images. Then when you actually teach them to cut it, when they first start, sometimes they change their entire design and make it much simpler and connected, because you can draw a lot more than you can cut. I think that's why I like paper cutting. It's not infinite. It's by definition has boundaries. It's probably the only place in my life, the only part of my life that I actually understand boundaries. And for me, actually cutting is meditative. When I do paper cutting workshops for adults, you know, we do history and I teach them, and I often give them templates that they could start with before they want to do their own. About half of them do their exercise, say, well, that's interesting. And about a quarter of them run screaming out of the room saying, why would I ever do this? This is awful. And I get one or two people who are sitting there cutting after the workshop saying, oh my God, I love this. It's a very specific skill. And I'll just finish with one thing, which is that, as I said, I find it meditative, and people think I'm crazy. But I do. Whenever I give these workshops, often people ask, well, what happens if you make a mistake? Well, I tell them two things. First of all, every single paper cut you saw had mistakes. That's why there's lots of flowers and plants. Not so much with deer's faces, which are an eighth of an inch big, but there's always mistakes. And sometimes there's acid-free mending tape. But the truth is, I tell them that I stop cutting before I make a mistake. So they say, aha, so how do you know you're going to make a mistake? So when I'm cutting, I kind of get this buzzing feeling. when I can't concentrate, when I can't see the cut before I make it. For me, paper cutting means I have to be totally present. If I miss a second, I'll cut off a piece of my finger, which I only did once, or I'll cut through an entire design, which I only did once in the beginning. After that, I learned to stop cutting when I can't give it my entire attention and love and concentration, where each cut isn't exactly what it should be. I stop. And the nice thing about paper cutting is you give it your best shot and that's it. You can't go back and correct. Can't erase. You can't correct. You can't work on it forever. Once you cut it out, it's gone. So that's also a lesson of be present in the moment and then let it go, pick it up, and that's what you have left.
Thanks. Thank you.
I think that's a long-winded answer to a one.
It was perfect. It was great. It was good. Thank you.
Anyone else have a question? Unmute yourself if you do.
So how much of, when you were talking about your own work, there's such a depth of understanding of the tradition and the scripture and the midrash. Did you come into it knowing that, or is paper cutting just a really wonderful, tangible way of learning the tradition because you're trying to do this and so you need to study up on it in a very, sort of physical way?
Another great question. The answer is both. I grew up in a conservadox home, and I was one of those weird kids that liked Hebrew school. And I also grew up before women could be rabbis and could learn. But I took a love of my culture, even when I went out of my culture and joined the revolution and did artwork for everybody else. I'd always come back for Seder. And then I had a kid and I realized I wanted to give him some of what the rooting that I had, and took him to Boston. And that's where I started doing paper cutting. And I started studying with people. I studied with Rabbi Nehemiah Paulin for 10 years. But you're right, Laura, every paper cut meant, it's like I was commissioned to illustrate this book about the Zohar. Well, so I studied with somebody about the Sefirot and Kabbalah, and through doing that book, I did this whole 3-year study. And every paper cut is like that. I joke that I've memorized parts of the Torah and our liturgy by cutting out each letter. And sometimes if I forget it, I have muscle memory of cutting out each letter. So every paper cut gave me a new opportunity. I've been really lucky. I've done commissions. I've had commissions for 30 years. So each one gave me that opportunity to learn something new and to go backwards into the tradition. So it's both.
Very fascinating. Anyone else have a question before we have to go for the evening? Now is your chance. Don't forget to unmute.
And I'll be sure to share your website so that people can go out and look. And with Dina's permission, there will be one of her paper cuts coming to a t-shirt sometime soon. And she said she clothes herself in t-shirts made from her paper cuts. So I'm going to
wearing
take
now?
the challenge. Yeah.
Is the t-shirt you're wearing now one of your paper cuts?
Oh, no, sorry. I have a friend who buys me t-shirts because I forgot to wear it. Sorry, Laura. Because she buys me t-shirts that look like my paper cuts.
Yeah, I mean, that's really extraordinary.
Mm-hmm. I'm actually wearing one of the klezmer Kirky rejects under my other shirt for luck, but it's not a paper cut. It's just, yeah.
It was great to meet Laura because she brings me back to where I started back in those political posters with silkscreen. Always one of my loves.
Anything?
So
I
if
just
you
have
ever-
kind of a basic question, like when you're doing a ketubah, for instance, how long would it take you to create that
4 months.
ornaments?
Because you have to talk to them, you have to send them the design, then you have to work with a calligrapher and you have to get the text. It used to be easy. There was one text. Now there's hundreds, and brides and grooms write their own. And then I have to figure out how to make Kermit the Frog sitting on a park bench playing the banjo fit into an overall structure, which is still beautiful and coherent. So it takes a long time, which is why when people ask me what I do, I tell them I'm an artist, therefore I have a day job. Because I don't want people to quit their day jobs and think you can make a living at this, although there have been a couple years where I have. But it takes a long time. And since I told you that I stop cutting before I make a mistake, you can't rush it. So it takes they take a long time.
Well, thank you so much for giving us such a fascinating evening.
Thank you.
And thank you, Laura, for introducing us to Dina, because we probably wouldn't have known about her. This was really great. And Laura, that's wonderful if you would get everybody the link to her website, and that we'll be seeing some of her creations on a t-shirt. So have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Dina all the
Bye,
way.
Thank you. Bye.
everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.